So there's basically two different types of loops, and those are for loops and while loops. So first we're going to go over the for loop. You'll see these used more commonly in your kind of average UnrealScript case. While loops are useful in certain cases where you're doing something kind of constant, or you have a potentially very long-running loop where you have another condition that's going to be checking into it, say like a bool or something like that. But for loops are very useful for when you have a fixed number of things that you need to loop over or iterate over, as you'll hear it referred to. So if you have a set number, in the case of an enumeration, there's a fixed number of entries in an enumeration, so you can loop over the length of that enumeration, so to speak, and be able to hit all the elements to check against them. So what we're going to do is set up a for loop right here, and we'll go ahead and put in our header. So you're going to start out with the keyword for, and we're going to do a space, and do a open and close parentheses. So inside the parentheses, you're going to need three different values or elements to define how the for loop will run. The first is going to be what you'll hear referred to as the index of the for loop. So what we usually, the common convention is to use I for index. So you'll see I equals 0. It's very common to start out because a lot of things in coding UnrealScript or C++ are 0-based, such as arrays. Then you'll see that 0 will be the first item that you want to set I to, so that you catch the very first element in an array or whatever other type of structure you're going to be iterating over. Now, I say I is kind of the convention for the index of a for loop, and you will see it a lot in a lot of cases where you're looking through different code files or different script files. In this case, you will see I used a lot. But I would actually kind of encourage you to name something more meaningful than I. If you're iterating over a list of items, then call it item ID. Something that kind of provides that readability, similar to why you would want to use enumerations throughout your script to kind of add that readability to it and provide a better context for what type of operation you're doing. For loops are a good chance to do the same thing by defining it as something named kind of appropriate to what you're iterating over. For this example, we're just going to leave it as I, but just know that you can name that anything you want, and it's a good opportunity to name it something meaningful given the context of what you're going to be iterating over in a for loop. So the second thing you're going to do is define what you're comparing against for the exit condition of the for loop. So the first element right here is defining what you're setting the start value of that index variable, which is going to be I. Second, you're going to say, I want a loop for as long as I is, in this case, we'll do less than 4. All right, so now we're saying start out with I at 0, and we want to keep running this for loop every time, continually, until I is, or as long as I is less than 4. So you're kind of like an if check. You're testing for true. So you're saying, is I less than 4? If so, go ahead and continue looping. And then the third element that you'll be putting here is generally going to be what you use to increment your variable. So the syntax for that is I++. And you'll see this is another kind of borrowed convention from C programming. And this just increments the variable by 1. So in the case of this, you're setting I to 0. You're saying as long as I is less than 4, keep looping. And every time you make an iteration on this loop, increment I by 1. So in this case, this for loop would run 4 times, because you're starting at 0, so I is 0 is less than 4, and then you increment it each time. So you're going to have 0, 1, 2, and 3. And then the 5th time through, when the I is equal to 4, this is going to resolve to false, and therefore it will exit out of the for loop. So if you put in kind of the curly braces here, now we can define some statement that we want to run. And a good example for how this is, there's a log function for UnrealScript. And we can just log a string here. So right there we've said the value of I is, and you can they have different string operators, and in this case we're going to use the $sign. And this is called concatenation. If you're not familiar with that term, you're saying I want to take 2 separate strings, in this case string number 1 here, and you want to merge it or append the second string onto it. That's what they call concatenation. So here we're going to put I, and this will, I'll figure out that it's a alphanumeric symbol, but it will append it on there. So what you have here, and probably would be a good idea to put a space here. You'll see this kind of stuff when you're doing string functions, whether it's building a custom string or putting in variables in a loop like we're doing here. This space just keeps the formatting correctly, because when it goes to concatenate the second variable here as a string, it will put it right at the end of this, which if you didn't have the extra space there, it would be stacked up against the S from the word is. So just add the space in there to handle that. All right, and then we'll go ahead and close the log statement. So what we have here is the very, very simple for loop that's going to run 4 times, and it's going to log this string out to the screen 4 times. And each time you're going to see this, since it's referencing the variable that we're using as the index in the loop, this is going to change each loop. So you're going to see this message printed 4 times. First is going to be the value of I is 0. Second, the value of I is 1, and so on up to 3. And then when it gets to I is equal to 4, this resolves to false, which means this will not process again. It will instead skip to the end and continue executing the script after the for loop. All right, so that's real basic for loop. There's a couple other things that we can note while we're here. One is that as long as you're operating with the braces, you can do as many lines inside of the for loop as you want. So for instance, if you didn't want to do the concatenation, then you could do a second line and just log I. So this would do it on 2 separate lines, and we don't need the extra space there. So this would say print the value of I is, and then it would do a new line and then print the number. So you would see 4 sets of 2 lines each. But anyway, the main point here is that we're showing you can do as many lines of script as you want inside of that for loop, and you can use the variable of I, or your index variable, as many times as you want in here, as long as you're not modifying that variable. You have to be careful. If you're going to modify this, you better have a good reason, because it's also being modified here every time it finishes a loop. And you want to make sure that you know, one, how that's going to behave, because if you're modifying it in here and here, that's getting 2 updates. So say you were adding something to it and then it increments it as well, you could have semi-unpredictable behavior. And then the other thing to remember is that if you are modifying the value that is used as the index, and you're doing something with it that kind of counters what the increment step is doing, then what you're going to have is a potential for an infinite loop, to where this will never test false and it would never exit this for loop. Now, if you're only going to have a single line of script for the for loop to operate, kind of going back to the original example with the concatenation, then what you can do here is actually get rid of the curly braces and just have a single indented line under the for loop statement. And this will just run this single line of script every time the for loop tests true and runs its iteration. This is not really, there's not really a right or wrong way to do it. This is kind of a preference. You probably will see most cases, even if it is a single line of execution, a lot of times people will still put in the curly braces, maybe out of habit or out of convention. A lot of studios will have their own coding standards, and some of them will require to use the curly braces regardless of how many lines the for loop is actually executing. So just keep that in mind. It is optional with a single line, but if you're going to have more than one line, then you have to have the curly braces. So we'll go ahead and real quickly put up the other case, just showing multiple lines of execution. Okay, so we'll go ahead and leave it like that, showing that there's the 2 different ways, basically single line, no braces, and multi-line, the requirement for braces. But just remember that you may always want to use the curly braces, even in the case where you do have a single line. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the for loop. The next loop that we're going to go over is the while loop.
So let's go ahead and put in our while loop heading here. Okay, so the main difference of the while loop from the for loop is that instead of kind of defining these 3 separate steps inside of the parentheses here, the while loop is just simply going to be it's more like an if statement in that you're just checking for a true or false value. So if we go ahead and put in our heading here, throw in our braces for what we're going to do inside of it. So basically in here, it's just looking for a true or false. Now you could put a true value here, but you would not really ever want to do this in a practical use case because a while loop is going to continuously loop forever as long as this is true inside of the parentheses. So if you're setting it to true, you've got an infinite loop basically. So you want to generally be checking against something here. But what's different is that you're not going to have the auto increment step that a for loop has. And you're also not defining the index inside of the parentheses in the same way. The difference would be a while loop is good for a type of case where you have something that you actually do want to loop an indeterminate amount of times, whereas a for loop you're iterating over, say, an array, and so you've got a fixed number of indices, and so you're going to iterate over the length of that array, checking each element. A while loop is good for type of thing where you're kind of waiting on maybe a game state change and you want something to continue running until something that is out of the control of in the case of the for loop, the loop itself, basically out of the control of the script, and it's waiting on maybe an event from the game. And then that event is changing the value of whatever you're checking against. That's one example, of what might be here. So this could be a bool value that is being set from another function or something along those lines. But another thing you can do is we'll just do a simple kind of local case here, and you see I'm using the local keyword because as with all this stuff in this kind of overview file, you'd be doing all this stuff inside of a function, and so you're going to be using local to define the variable, not the var keyword. So just keep in mind all these examples are inside of a function. So local, we'll do an int. We're just going to stick with the I for now, since we don't have a particular case of what we're iterating over. And so we're going to set that equal to 0. So here, what we can do, one example would be to do basically the same case that we are doing in the for loop above, is checking for I is less than 4. In the case of the for loop, where you're incrementing I every time, we said it's going to iterate over it 4 times basically. So here we've got I is less than 4, but we're just checking for a simple true case. So inside the while loop is where you need to have sort of your exit condition defined, at least in the case where you have a local variable like this. You definitely would need that. Just so we could have something here, let's put in a log. So we have our log statement there. And then here, just as an example, we're going to do I. What we have here is the equivalent of incrementing by 1, since we're adding 1 to each time. So in this very simple case of a while loop inside of a function with that's a local variable defined for what we're going to be checking against, you have the equivalent of the for loop up here, because this incrementation of the index variable is happening right here where we're incrementing I. And then, in this case is going to test false at the same time that the for loop one would. So again, just going to get the same output that you would expect from the for loop in that case above. As we go, like another example here of a while loop, another example of a while loop would be to take it and do something a little bit more complex with it. Just for an example, we'll do another local here, and we'll do a bool. We'll call this loop condition, and we'll set it equal to true. So then we have our while loop, and we're going to check against loop condition. So now we have something that could technically be an infinite loop if we aren't handling loop condition appropriately, but it's different than the case of what I first had typed where it was just while true, which would definitely be an infinite loop. In this case, loop condition could be changed by something. So depending on what's happening inside the while loop, for instance, we could set up here. So we have an early exit condition if check, and if so, we will break out of the loop. So the break keyword here will break you out of the while loop independent of the while condition being true. That's one option for getting out of your loop. And then we could have other code in here that's doing something, doing something else, multiple lines of script here, and then we could have another check where we want to check for another exit condition. These are all fictional, but just to give you an example of the flow. So inside here, what we might want to do is set our loop condition, which is our local scoped variable. So we're inside a function, the local variable, loop condition is what we're checking against. Loop condition here, we're going to set equal to true. So we're still looping in this case. And then we're going to continue. So the continue keyword will break you out of the execution of, if there's more stuff happening below here. So we can still do something else here, but if we want to have this mid-exit condition, the continue, we're still leaving loop condition as true, but we're breaking, not really breaking, we're continuing out saying start the loop over again. So whatever we're doing up here presumably is what's setting the mid-exit condition. And so if this is true by the time we get through the execution here, we want to loop back instead of going down and finishing whatever scripting is down here. And then say you have your normal exit condition here, and all this is doing is setting loop condition to false. So just recap really quickly, this is a case where we're looping as long as this is true. We're starting out with it set to true. We have some early exit condition, which could be a variable that is a variable of the class. It could be local to this function as well that we would be operating inside. But if that is true, we're breaking out of this while loop and saying it doesn't matter what this is, we're done, and continue on. So say this is false, we're going to come in, do something else, and then we're going to check, should we exit this loop or should we stop processing the remaining script lines down here and start the loop again. And if so, that would be our mid-exit condition. We're setting this to true more as an example that we're still looping. This would still be true because as soon as it's false, you're going to break out anyway. But the main point here is to hit the continue, which is going to stop execution and start back here at the beginning of the while loop. So we're going to check again, do the same things. If this is now not true. Now, one thing you got to remember when you're looping is, in this case, it would be kind of an assumption that you would want to also set the mid-exit condition back to false, because whatever logic is presumably happening here that set this true, you'd want that to only happen that one time. Otherwise, you would never get past this point if you just set it to true and then left it there. So unless this is also being set to false here and some other if checks or something along those lines, the case where you did test it was true and you want to continue out, you want to make sure before you do that to set this back to false, so that this will only get tripped again if the appropriate logic was triggered. So if this was not set to true, and so we'll presume that this is false, then you're going to continue on, we do something else, and then we come down and hit our normal exit condition, which is going to set, if this was true and we wanted to break out of the loop, we would set this to true, or you could just set that variable to true either way, just kind of trying to show the idea of the early, mid, and normal execution, or exit condition, excuse me. Okay, so that's kind of a quick summary of the while loop. You're going to see these probably less commonly when you're looking through existing UnrealScript files than the for loops. For loop is, a lot more common and generally more practical in everyday use cases than the while loop, but the while loop has its uses and you will see them in use. So I wanted to make sure we talked about kind of the difference and so you'll understand that if you see an example of that.